In the winter of 1240, a Mongol scout rode into Batu Khan's war camp, trembling so violently he could barely speak. This wasn't fear of punishment. This was a man who had witnessed something that broke his mind. "They are not men," he stammered. "They are demons from the frozen north who command fire and ice." Now here's what makes this terrifying. These Mongols had just obliterated the armies of Kievan Rus. They'd burned Kiev to ash. They'd crushed the combined forces of Poland and Hungary like insects. These were the warriors who conquered half the known world. So what could possibly make them retreat in absolute terror? By the end of this video, you're going to discover 3 things that will completely change how you understand medieval warfare. First, the impossible battle strategy that used the Mongols' own tactics against them and left thousands drowning in freezing water. Second, the one weapon the Vikings deployed that the Mongols had never encountered in their entire conquest of Asia and Europe, a weapon so terrifying that Mongol shamans declared the land cursed by foreign gods. And third, the intelligence discovery that made the Mongol leadership abandon their entire European invasion. Here's what makes this story absolutely insane. This battle was deliberately erased from most historical records. The Mongols didn't want to admit what happened. The Vikings' accounts were dismissed as mythology, and modern historians only recently uncovered the archaeological proof that this nightmare actually occurred. If you want to see how approximately 300 Vikings humiliated the greatest army ever assembled, an army of over 20,000 warriors who had never lost a European campaign, then smash that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next defies everything you think you know about medieval warfare, and you won't believe what these Baltic defenders did to stop the unstoppable Mongol war machine. Let's go back to 1240, and I'm going to show you how this impossible victory happened. Picture this, it's early 1240, and the Mongol Empire is at the absolute height of its power. Led by generals Batu Khan and the legendary strategist Subutai, arguably the greatest military mind in history, the Mongol horde is sweeping through Eastern Europe like a tsunami of death. Kiev, obliterated, the Russian principalities, crushed, Poland and Hungary, their combined armies massacred at the Battle of Legnica and Mohyl. We're talking about 40,000 European knights and soldiers annihilated in just 2 battles. The Mongol war machine operates with a 90% success rate across 60 years of continuous warfare. They've perfected psychological warfare, logistics, cavalry tactics, and siege technology to a degree that won't be matched until the Napoleonic era, 600 years later. Now moving toward the Baltic coastline, the Mongols encounter something unexpected: Viking descendant settlements in what's now Estonia and Latvia. By 1240, most historians will tell you the Viking age is over. The great raids have ended. The legendary warrior culture is supposedly finished. They're wrong. These Baltic Vikings and their allies have been watching the Mongol advance with growing dread. They know what's coming. They've heard the stories of burning cities and pyramids built from human skulls. They know that when the Mongols arrive, you have 2 choices: submit completely or face total annihilation. But here's where this gets interesting, and why historians tried to bury this story. The battle that happens next is mysteriously absent from most Mongol chronicles. Think about that. The Mongols kept meticulous records of their conquests. They bragged about their victories. They documented their strategies. But this particular encounter, almost completely scrubbed from their official histories, that's a massive red flag for historians. When an empire deliberately forgets a battle, something went catastrophically wrong. The stakes couldn't be higher. Batu Khan commands over 20,000 battle-hardened warriors, men who have conquered everything from China to Eastern Europe. Facing them, approximately 300 to 500 Viking defenders and their local allies. The odds are roughly 40 to 1. The winner controls the critical Baltic trade routes worth billions in modern currency. The loser faces extinction, but the Vikings know something the Mongols don't. They understand their home terrain in ways that steppe warriors never could, and they're about to prove that sometimes the greatest advantage isn't numbers or technology, it's knowing exactly where to make your stand. What happens next is so brilliant, so brutally effective, that it will be studied in military academies 800 years later. Don't click away yet, because the Vikings' opening move is about to use the Mongols' own signature tactic against them, and the result is absolutely catastrophic. Imagine you are a Mongol cavalry commander. You've won every battle you've ever fought. You've perfected the feigned retreat. You pretend to run away, the enemy chases you, and then your hidden forces encircle and destroy them. It's worked flawlessly from China to Poland. Now picture this, it's February 1240, and you're pursuing Viking forces across the frozen wasteland of Lake Peipus. The Vikings are retreating in disorganized clusters. They look desperate. They look beaten. Every instinct you've developed over years of conquest tells you, this is it. This is where we finish them. You order the charge. Here's what the Mongol commanders don't realize. This entire retreat is a carefully calculated trap. The Vikings have studied the ice thickness for weeks. They know exactly how much weight it can support. They've measured it. They've tested it. The Vikings are wearing specially designed spiked boots, essentially medieval crampons. They're moving in tight, disciplined formations that distribute their weight across maximum surface area. Each man knows his position. Each group knows the safe paths. But those Mongol horses, each one weighs 800 to 1,000 pounds. Add a fully armored rider, another 200 pounds minimum. Now multiply that by thousands of cavalry charging at full speed, concentrating all that weight onto small points of impact. The Vikings have positioned themselves at the one spot where the ice is thick enough to support infantry, but thin enough to fail catastrophically under massed cavalry. The Livonian rhymed chronicle, written by eyewitnesses, describes what happens next. Great cracking like thunder split the air. The lake opened its mouth like a beast. The ice doesn't just crack, it explodes upward in massive sheets. Thousands of pounds of cavalry plunge through into water that's 39 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. We're talking about 3,000 to 5,000 Mongol warriors and their horses hitting water so cold it stops your heart within minutes. Now imagine you're that Mongol warrior. You're in full armor, leather, metal plates, helmet, weapons. You just fell through ice into water that feels like knives stabbing every inch of your skin. Your horse is thrashing in panic, pulling you down. Your armor, which protects you in battle, now weighs you down like an anchor. You try to grab the ice edge, but your fingers are already going numb. You can't feel them, you can't grip. The ice keeps breaking under your weight. Your fellow warriors are screaming, drowning around you. Some are trapped under the ice, desperately searching for the hole they fell through. The Russian Novgorod chronicles record it simply, barbarians drowned in cursed northern waters. Here's something that'll blow your mind. In 2018, underwater archaeologists conducted surveys of Lake Peipus. At depths of 40 feet, they found Mongol armor, weapons, and horse remains scattered across the lake bed. The carbon dating matches perfectly 1,240. The physical evidence confirms this nightmare actually happened. The Vikings watch from safe positions as the Mongol cavalry destroys itself. Casualties estimated 3,000 to 5,000 in just minutes. It's one of the most catastrophic tactical disasters in Mongol military history. But here's what nobody tells you about what happens next. The Vikings don't just watch the Mongols drown. They don't show mercy. They don't follow the medieval conventions of warfare. Because what the Vikings do next is so savage, so completely outside the rules of 13th century combat, that it breaks something fundamental in the Mongol psyche. They deploy a weapon that the Mongols, who have conquered from China to Poland, have never encountered. The Mongol survivors are struggling in the freezing water, desperately trying to reach solid ice, when the Vikings begin throwing pottery vessels onto the lake's surface. At first, the Mongols think these are just projectiles. Then the vessels shatter, and thick, oily liquid spreads across the water. Then the Vikings light it on fire. What you need to understand is that the Mongols have never seen incendiary weapons that burn on water. They've conquered the sophisticated militaries of China, Persia, and Russia. They've faced every weapon technology of the 13th century. But Greek fire, this Byzantine secret weapon that's been jealously guarded for centuries, they have absolutely no context for what they're witnessing. The Baltic Vikings obtained Greek fire through their extensive trade connections with Constantinople. It's basically medieval napalm, a petroleum-based mixture that burns at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit and cannot be extinguished by water. In fact, water makes it spread faster. Imagine you're in that freezing lake now. The cold is already killing you. You're watching your friends drown around you. Your horse is dead. And now the water itself, is on fire with flames that won't go out no matter how much you splash or dive. The eyewitness accounts describe it as liquid hell that cannot be extinguished. Here's where the psychological damage goes beyond just military defeat. Rashid al-Din, the official Mongol court historian, records something fascinating in his Secret of the Histories. He doesn't describe this as a battle loss. He calls it northern sorcery with demon fire. Think about what that means. The Mongols are being trained from childhood that they're the chosen people of Tengri, the eternal blue sky god. They believe their conquests are divinely mandated. They're not just militarily superior, they're cosmically destined to rule. And now they're facing an enemy who commands both ice and fire simultaneously. In Mongol shamanic tradition, controlling opposing elemental forces is the mark of supernatural power. The survivors who make it back to camp aren't just reporting a military defeat, they're reporting that they fought demons. The Baltic German chronicles record the Viking battle cries during this phase. They're deliberately shouting about frost giants, about Ragnarok, about northern gods. They know the Mongols are superstitious. They're amplifying the psychological warfare. The Mongol shamans examine the survivors and declare, on the record, that this territory is cursed by foreign gods and should be abandoned. Let that sink in. The Mongols, who have just conquered half of Asia and burned Kiev to the ground, are being told by their spiritual advisors to retreat because they've entered cursed demon territory. The numbers tell the story. Mongol casualties for this engagement, 40% to 60% of engaged forces. That's catastrophic by any military standard, but for the Mongols, who typically suffer casualty rates under 10%, this is an unthinkable disaster. Viking losses, approximately 80 to 120 warriors. Heavy, yes, but sustainable. They can recover from this. The Mongols are shaken to their core. Now you might think this is where the story ends. The Mongols retreat. The Vikings celebrate. End of battle, right? Wrong, because the burning lake was just the opening act. When the Mongol generals regroup their forces and prepare for a revenge campaign, when they commit to wiping these northern demons off the face of the earth, the Vikings unveil their ultimate nightmare tactic. And this one will haunt the Mongol military for years. I know this is getting intense, but if you're still watching, you clearly appreciate history's most brutal and brilliant military strategies. Make sure you're subscribed, because next week I'm revealing the African kingdom that defeated European colonizers for 400 years using tactics that modern military academies still study. But first, let's finish this Viking story, because what happens in the forest is even more terrifying than the burning lake. Batu Khan is furious. He's lost thousands of men to ice and fire. His troops are demoralized. His shamans are whispering about curses, but he's still commanding over 15,000 warriors, and he's not about to let a few hundred northern barbarians humiliate the Mongol Empire. He orders a full pursuit. Find the Vikings, destroy them completely, make an example that will terrify all of northern Europe. The Vikings retreat inland. And this is where they deploy terrain warfare 700 years before modern military doctrine even has a term for it. They disappear into the dense Baltic forests. Now, put yourself in the position of a Mongol cavalry commander. Your entire military doctrine is built around mobility, speed, and overwhelming force. You fight in open steppes where your composite bows have 200-yard effective range. Your horses can maneuver in coordinated formations. Your tactics involve encirclement, feigned retreats, and rapid redeployment. But this forest, the trees are so dense, we're talking about 1,200 plus trees per hectare, that you literally cannot ride more than 20 feet before encountering obstacles. Your horses can't maneuver, your bows are useless at 10-foot range. Your armor is too heavy for dismounted forest combat. You've just entered a cavalry kill zone. The historical source that confirms this is absolutely fascinating. Juvenie's History of the World Conqueror, a chronicle celebrating Mongol victories, contains a rare admission: the Mongol forces cannot pursue into the dark woods. For an empire that prides itself on conquering any terrain, this is a humiliating acknowledgement. The Vikings, meanwhile, are implementing guerrilla warfare tactics with brutal precision. Swedish sagas describe specific tree-to-tree warrior craft, techniques taught explicitly to counter steppe riders. This isn't improvisation, this is trained doctrine. Here's how it works. The Vikings have pre-positioned supply caches throughout the forest. Food, water, weapons, replacement gear, everything they need for extended operations. The Mongols, who rely on speed and their horses grazing on grasslands, are stuck carrying limited supplies through impassable terrain. The Vikings use horn signals that echo confusingly through the dense trees, disrupting Mongol coordination. When you can't see more than 30 feet in any direction and you're hearing attack signals coming from everywhere, unit cohesion collapses. And then there's the close-quarters combat. The Vikings revive berserker tactics, frenzied, terrifying close-quarters axe combat designed for confined spaces. Imagine you're a Mongol warrior. You're dismounted. Your bow is useless. Your leather armor is designed for mobility against arrows, not for stopping a Viking battle axe swung with both hands from 5 feet away. You hear screaming from multiple directions. You can't see the enemy until they're literally on top of you. Your commanders can't coordinate because the forest breaks up formations. And these Vikings are fighting on home terrain they've trained in since childhood. The Mongol military, the most sophisticated fighting force on the planet, is being reduced to confused, isolated groups getting systematically hunted through the woods. This forest campaign drags on for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of continuous losses. 3 weeks of deteriorating morale. 3 weeks of stretched supply lines and mounting casualties that the Mongols simply cannot sustain this far from their core territories. Batu Khan's officers begin asking the unthinkable question, is this territory worth the cost? And that's when the critical intelligence arrives that changes everything. But here's what nobody tells you, and this is the part that'll absolutely blow your mind. The real reason the Mongols abandoned their European conquest wasn't just military defeat. It was a strategic intelligence discovery that made the entire campaign untenable. During the forest campaign, the Vikings capture several Mongol scouts, and under interrogation, which in the 13th century is not a gentle process, these scouts reveal something that fundamentally changes the Mongol strategic calculus. The Viking defenses they've encountered, the ice tactics, the Greek fire, the forest warfare doctrine, they're replicated across all of Scandinavia. Every Viking settlement from the Baltic to Norway has been preparing for this invasion. They've been sharing intelligence, tactics, and resources. The frozen lake trap isn't a one-time trick. Every major lake and river in the region has been mapped for identical operations. The forest ambush doctrine is standard training. The incendiary weapons have been distributed to multiple settlements. Put yourself in Batu Khan's position now. You've just lost thousands of warriors to 300-500 defenders. Your intelligence now tells you that conquering the rest of Scandinavia will require fighting this same battle against these same tactics dozens more times. The Mongol generals run a strategic assessment, and for the first time in their expansion history, the cost-benefit analysis fails. Conquering Northern Europe would require committing over 100,000 troops, more than they can sustain this far from their supply bases. Those troops would be fighting in impossible terrain, endless forests, frozen lakes, boggy coastlines where cavalry is useless. The campaign would take years, with continuous casualties, against an enemy who's proven they can inflict 40–60% casualty rates. And for what? The Baltic trade routes are valuable, yes, but are they worth bleeding the empire dry in an environment where all of their tactical advantages disappear? The answer, shockingly, is no. In 1241, Batu Khan sends a report back to Great Khan Urgide in Karakoram, the Mongol capital. The message is carefully worded. The Mongols never admit defeat, but the conclusion is clear. The northern kingdoms are not worth the losses required to subdue them. Shortly after, the Mongol forces pivot their focus back toward the Middle East and China, where the terrain favors their tactics and the conquests are more profitable. Western Europe has been accidentally saved by Baltic Viking resistance. Now here's where this gets absolutely mind-blowing in terms of historical consequences. If the Mongols had pushed through, if they'd committed to conquering Northern Europe despite the costs, here's what likely happens. France is next. The French knights fight bravely, but they're using outdated heavy cavalry tactics that the Mongols have defeated 100 times. France falls. The Holy Roman Empire is divided and politically fragmented. The Mongols excel at exploiting political divisions. The German territories fall. England is protected by the Channel, but even that might not save them. The Mongols have siege technology and naval capabilities that could make a crossing feasible. Medieval European civilization, already weakened by the earlier Crusades, could be completely erased. The Italian city-states that will fund the Renaissance, burned to ash. The universities and monasteries preserving classical knowledge, destroyed. The cultural and intellectual infrastructure that leads to the Age of Enlightenment, gone. The modern Western world as you know it might never exist. All of that was prevented by approximately 300–500 Viking defenders who refused to surrender and fought with such tactical brilliance that they broke the Mongol war machine's momentum. Now, I told you at the beginning that this story was deliberately erased from history. Here's why. The Mongol chronicles minimize these defeats because it contradicts their narrative of divine mandate and invincibility. You can't admit that a tiny force of northern barbarians made you retreat in terror. The Viking accounts, meanwhile, got exaggerated into mythological sagas, stories about gods and giants and supernatural powers. Later historians dismissed them as fantasy because they sounded too incredible to be real. But modern archaeology is proving the core story is true. Between 2015 and 2018, excavations at Lake Peipus uncovered Mongol weapons, armor fragments, and horse remains scattered across the lake bed. Carbon dating confirms 1240 timeframe, exactly when these battles occurred. Trauma patterns on recovered armor are consistent with Viking axes and spears, not with other Mongol weapons. The physical evidence confirms what the fragmentary chronicles hinted at. This actually happened. And here's one final twist that'll mess with your head. Genetic studies of Baltic populations show unexpected Mongol DNA markers in concentrations that don't match the typical patterns of conquest. What does that mean? It suggests that at least some Mongol survivors didn't get killed or expelled, they integrated into the local populations. The Vikings didn't just defeat them, some were assimilated. It's a strangely human ending to a story of brutal warfare. Even enemies as fierce as the Mongols and Vikings found ways to coexist after the fighting stopped. So what's the final tally on this forgotten battle that changed world history? 300 to 500 Vikings achieved what entire kingdoms couldn't. They forced the Mongol Empire into a strategic retreat. They proved that Mongol invincibility was conditional, that terrain, tactics, and home field advantage could overcome technological and numerical superiority. And in doing so, they preserved the Western European development trajectory that leads, centuries later, to the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the modern world. This battle is now studied in military academies worldwide as a textbook case of asymmetric warfare. How does a vastly outnumbered force defeat a technologically superior enemy? You use terrain as a weapon. You attack psychology as much as bodies. You make the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. You can see these same principles playing out today. Ukraine's 2022 defense against Russian invasion echoes the identical strategic concepts: smaller force, home terrain advantage, unconventional tactics, and willingness to fight on ground where the enemy's advantages disappear. The technology has changed. The fundamental principles haven't. History reminds us, again and again, that technological superiority and overwhelming numbers don't guarantee victory. Strategy, terrain knowledge, and the will to fight on your terms can overcome seemingly impossible odds. The Vikings understood this in 1240, and that understanding saved Western civilization from being conquered by the greatest military force the medieval world had ever seen. Now here's my question for you. Could the Mongols have conquered all of Europe if they'd pushed through regardless of the costs? Or were the Vikings' tactics replicable enough that they would have faced the same nightmare in every forest and frozen lake across the continent? Think about the strategic reality. Every mile westward stretches Mongol supply lines further from their Asian power base. Every forest and river is controlled by defenders who have now learned what works against steppe cavalry. Every winter makes the terrain more impassable. What do you think? Drop your analysis in the comments below, and I'm not looking for simple yes or no answers. Tell me your strategic reasoning. What would you have done if you were Batu Khan receiving that intelligence report? If you want more forgotten battles where impossible odds were overcome by brilliant tactics, Check out this video next. It's about the African kingdom that defeated European colonizers for 400 years using strategies that make the Vikings look conventional. And make sure you're subscribed, because next week I'm revealing exactly how that African kingdom used terrain, intelligence networks, and psychological warfare to make European empires bleed themselves dry trying to conquer land that was right in front of them, but always just out of reach. Hit that subscribe button now, because the history they didn't teach you in school, that's the history that'll change how you see the world.